mandatory voting needs to be there in the society because it will reflect all the voices and all the citizens in order to create governments that address the people efficiently and directly. So before I move on to my substantive points for today's debate, I have two main rebuttals. On the first rebuttal, on how their principle is about silence and how people have autonomy. On the principle level, we see that since people are fed up, if these people are fed up with politics, isn't there a reason for that politics to change? For those political parties to ensure that citizens are going to be more interested in the politics of that country, because the parties has a responsibility to the country in the first place. The parties has a responsibility in order to ensure that these citizens want to vote for them, because the government are the people who set the policies. That is why we see that there has to be mandatory voting, because in our side we already showed you that there is an abstain check. There is an abstain check on the voting paper. And when there's an abstain on the voting paper, these people can just not vote for any political party. And when they don't vote for any political party, it means that all those political parties in that country has to change, because citizens just simply do not see that those political parties are addressing the people's needs. But moving on to my second level of this rebuttal, on how they challenge the need for mandatory voting. Because we see that voting in principle is for choosing the government. That is why it is there in the first place, in order to ensure that governments are going to address the people. And that is why citizens have the responsibility to abide by this. This is because it is going to go to, the benefits are going to go to the citizens in the first place, because the government has to address the needs of the citizens. But moving on to my second rebuttal, on how they talked about people can voice out their opinions through protests and petitions. We don't understand their logic, because now they're talking about protests and petitions where those are minor options for those people, because petitions are there in the first place where the government is doing something that those citizens don't like. But voting is there as a major option for these people to voice out their opinions. But also they told us on how people are fed up. So if people are fed up, why would they voice out their opinions through petitions in the first place? They wouldn't just voice out their opinions at all, and they wouldn't have a political voice as a result. And when we don't have a political voice, we see in the country what is going to happen is that the government is not going to be efficient. The government is not going to reflect the people, and when they don't reflect the people, we don't exactly see how the country can develop in the long term as well in the short term scenario. So moving on to my argument for today's debate. But before I move on,
Madam, you said political parties should be the ones responsible for bringing people to an election. Why then you take responsibility out of their hands by making voting compulsory?
Because right now, when we see that these political parties need to make sure that those policies appeal to those citizens in the first place, they need to make sure the government has to be the one to enforce this. Because the government has the power to make sure that all citizens are abiding by this policy. And when that happens, those political parties can then encourage these people to vote by making their policies more appealing and more directly applied to their needs. So moving on to my substantive, that mandatory voting empowers minorities and create awareness. On the first level of analysis, that the government's responsibility to address minorities in the society, because the entire role of the government is to protect the people and address their needs, where the minorities as well has to be addressed because they are part of the country. This is important because the entire value of democratic countries or countries in general is that it has to provide equal opportunities for all citizens, where all citizens need to be provided the opportunity to raise up their voice. And this is why they can then tell the government what they want and what the government needs to do to address those people in the society. But furthermore, we see an additional benefit from our side of the house, because we see with those citizenship classes, what we're doing is that we're also educating these citizens about their rights. We're telling these citizens exactly how they can demand their rights from the government, how they can act as a check and balance, and why exactly is a check and balance important. We see it is important because it is an essential value for these governments to work efficiently, in order to ensure that these governments are going to understand what these people want. So moving on to my second level of analysis, that mandatory voting creates awareness.
Point of
Because we
information, ma'am.
see that there are minorities in the society, such as gender minorities or women in general. Women in these traditional societies are seen as people without any political power, where they should stay at home and not come to vote. And we see when that happens, there is no voice of those women reflected in the votes to the government. This is why we see mandatory voting needs to be there, because people are going to be more aware. Because when we make it mandatory, it means that we are forcing them to make the choice. But we also see that we are pushing them to think about the decision. We are telling them how important that decision is. And when we're telling how important that decision is, they can start to know what they're standing for. They can start to know their own opinion. And this is important. When these women do not know their opinion in the first place, if they are told by all other people in the society that they don't have any political power, we have to empower these people who don't have a political voice. We have to make it mandatory, because we see when these women are used to be treated like that, when they don't have any political power, they just let it go. But we see that these women have to consider what they are going through, and that can only happen if we are pushing them to think and pushing them to consider what their rights should be. But we also see that it is going to be safer for these people, because it's going to bring self-autonomy for these women indirectly, which is also empowering these women in the long-term scenario. But we also talk about people in general, on people in general, because there are, for example, there are workers whose income is very low. And when it's very low, it affects their standard of living. And we see, for example, when workers cannot complain to these companies that their pay is low, because they would just get fired and we would just push them into poverty or push them into a more worse state than they already have. This is why governments should make sure that their policies are addressing them and that voters should come to vote because of this. Because then, if governments make policies that address these people in the first place, then these voters and these workers who have a low pay will also be addressed, where the governments will also make sure that these companies are paying those workers right and making sure that these workers are going to have a stable income. But this is why, moving on to my third level of analysis, that mandatory voting is going to allow efficient policies. Because since these non-voters are not going to be reflected in the policies of the government will only be addressing the voters in the first place. The non-voters will not be addressed. And when this happens, there is one part of society that is not addressed by the government, because the government would just simply not care because they are not voting. We have to address all of the society as a whole. But we also see that this is why minorities are important. This is why the mandatory voting is important, to reflect the society as a whole and ensure that we have opinions. Thank you very much.